Previously on Sodor, the early years.
Dinna tell me he and Alfred are still carrying on with that wee argument of theirs.
Alright. As I've told you before, Gordon, that was an axie. Oh, never mind. I think I got the wrong impression about you. As the victim of a misperception myself, I know exactly how that feels. I'm sorry, Diesel. As Diesel turned on the turntable, he couldn't help wondering exactly what Alfred had meant. Maybe, he thought, he would find out one day. Early one evening, James was returning to the sheds after what had been a busier day than usual. Henry had been sent to the works that morning for an inspection and overhaul. It was something each engine on the railway had to have done every 5 years or so. As he approached the water tower, James heard two familiar voices arguing loudly. He sighed, then glanced over as Alice chuffed up next to him. She cast a worried glance at the sheds.
What's that about?
Did you see that B-12 who arrived earlier today? James asked.
Yes, I met him at Knapford earlier. His name's Alfred, isn't it?
That's right. He and Gordon don't exactly get on. And with that, James backed down into the shed. I see they're still at it, he commented to Edward.
I'm afraid so, James, replied the blue engine.
Do they normally argue like this?
Alice asked quietly. Yes, James replied. This bad water between them's been going on since before I got here. He shot an inquiring look over at Edward. The blue engine had been here almost since the beginning of the Northwest Railway. Maybe he might be able to shed some light on the situation. There was an accident when Gordon first came to the railway, Edward explained. And he believes Alfred to be responsible? Asked Diesel. Edward shot him a surprised look. How did you know that? He asked. Oh, just something Alfred said the last time he was here. Why would Gordon think Alfred is responsible? James asked.
I'm afraid I don't really know the whole story, Edward replied.
Well, why don't we ask them?
Alice asked, punctuating her question with a sharp blast of her whistle. Silence fell when she'd finished, but Gordon and Alfred were still glaring at each other. It was James who broke the silence.
This argument of yours has kept us up enough nights, every other time Alfred's visited. Can't you two just end it?
Well, if this pompous oaf will admit he's got it wrong. Well, if you hadn't tried to... Silence! Bellowed a familiar voice. All of the engines looked down to see the Fat Controller standing in front of the shed. He looked sternly from Alice to Gordon to Alfred.
What is the meaning of all this? He demanded angrily.
I'm sorry, sir.
I didn't mean you, Alice. He turned to the big engines. James is right. This feud has been going on for long enough. You two have been acting like children for 60 years. But sir, both engines said at once. The Fat Controller held up his hand. I know you both have your sides of the story, but what we need to look at are the facts. And what facts would those be, sir? Diesel said, asking the question on all the engines' minds. The Fat Controller cleared his throat. As a young Charles Topham Hatt, I witnessed the beginning of this story, although I didn't quite know it then. After all, I was only 9 years old at the time. However, The Railway Inspectorate report and my father's papers provide a clear set of facts.
Your father?
Yes, the original Sir Topham Hatt. He built this railway, you know. The Fat Controller thought back to 1923. The Northwest Railway had been quite different back then. The main sheds were still at Tidmouth, as the ones at Knapford were yet to be built. Edward had been relegated to the sheds, following the completion of the big station at Knapford. Only Alfred, Henry, and Winston, the Red Engine, were there to work the main line, and they all looked after both passengers and goods. Thomas was there too, but he was living in a shed next to the newly completed Knapford station. After all, he was the station pilot there. Branch lines were handled by older, smaller tank engines. One afternoon, the Fat Director, the first Sir Topham Hatt, had taken his son down to the sheds. "Charles, there is something I would like to show you," he said. "What would that be, father?" Charles asked. "It's a surprise," replied the director. A moment later, Thomas arrived at the shed. "Good afternoon, engines. Now, you're probably wondering why I've called you all here," began the Fat Director. Thomas glanced over cheekily. "To announce I'm getting my own branch line, sir?" he said. The Fat Director chuckled. "Not quite, Thomas. I've called you all here to introduce you to someone." "This is Gordon, from the newly formed London and North Eastern Railway. He will be visiting us for a couple of weeks. Please make him feel welcome." "I'm pleased to meet you all," Gordon said. "Pleased to meet you too," Henry replied. Charles looked closely at the new arrival. He had never seen such a big engine. "What type of engine is he, father?" he asked. "He's a Pacific type, a new design." "You're built for fast passenger trains, are you not?" "That's correct, sir." "Then I would like you to take the Wildnorwester tomorrow morning." "Certainly, sir," Gordon replied. He wasn't quite sure what the Wildnorwester was, but he waited until the Fat Director and Charles had left before saying anything. "It's our premier passenger train," Alfred explained. "I usually hand it over to an LMS engine at Barrow-in-Furness." The next morning, Gordon couldn't help feeling a little bit nervous as he backed down onto the waiting train. He had never really pulled passengers before, having been an experimental prototype on the LNER and its predecessor, the GNR. He glanced over at Henry, who was waiting on the next platform. "Henry, I don't suppose you'd have any advice on pulling this train?" "I'm afraid I don't usually pull it, Gordon. You see, I'm not really that good at steaming." "I understand," Gordon said sympathetically. The guard's whistle sounded out a moment later, and it was time for Gordon to leave. He quickly brought the heavy train up to speed, and he was soon cruising along the line. When he reached Barrow in Furness, it was a full quarter of an hour early. Once the Wildnorwester had been handed over to the LMS, Gordon was running light back to Knapford. As he approached Crosby Station, Gordon spotted the station master waving a red flag. He stopped next to the platform. "Henry's broken down at the next signal box," said the station master. "Can you help?" "Of course," Gordon replied. He slowly eased forward, proceeding cautiously down the line. Gordon soon reached Henry, having picked up his train's guard a mile down the line. "I'm sorry about this," Henry said, as their drivers conferred. "It's quite all right, Henry," Gordon replied. Gordon's driver returned to his cab a moment later, and he ran around in front of Henry, backing down onto the train. They were quickly coupled together and set off for the yard at Knapford. Meanwhile, at Knapford station, Alfred had just arrived with a passenger train. To his surprise, the fat director was waiting on the platform when he steamed in. The director greeted one of the passengers warmly as he stepped down from the coach. "Good afternoon, Mr. Gresley." "Good afternoon, Sir Topham. May I inquire how Gordon's trial run is going?" "He performed admirably with this morning's Wildnorwester. Arrived a full quarter hour early at Barrow." "I'm glad to hear it. I'd like to keep Gordon for a bit longer, Mr. Gresley, as per our arrangement." "Of course. Also, should I decide to keep Gordon as a part of our railway, would you be willing to take one of our 460s as part payment?" "Certainly, if you can spare him." "Well, we would have Gordon looking after the express. Shall we discuss this further in my office?" "By all means." As the two men strode away, neither of them noticed the worried look on Alfred's face. "But I'm the express engine." As Alfred was about to uncouple from the train, Gordon and Henry steamed by. "Oh, great," Alfred said. "Now he's rescuing stricken trains." A little while later, Alfred arrived at the sheds, still worried. Edward looked over, catching the worried expression on the bigger engine's face. "You seem worried, Alfred." "I am, little Edward," Alfred replied. He quickly explained what he had overheard on the platform. "He must have meant me. I mean, Gordon's doing a much better performance on the Wildnorwester than I ever could, and he rescued Henry." "You don't want to go back to the LNER?" Edward asked, slightly puzzled. "I'm the pride of the line here, Edward. When people think of our prestige passenger train, they think of me. If I go back to the LNER, I'll be on freights and local trains the whole time." "I understand," Edward said. "I'm sure that if you show you're really useful to the railway, the fat director won't send you away." "Yes, you have a point. I'll see to it that Pacific doesn't take my place.